What's up and welcome to another episode of Movie Pitch Monday. This is a show where I pitch hypothetical movie ideas. And if you don't know who I am, I'm Edward Mullen, I'm an author and I do this show. So in today's movie pitch, I want to kind of honor Stan Lee, who just passed away this week. And you know, he's one of my heroes. I grew up reading Marvel. I'm a huge fan of Marvel. I did a Miles Morales SpiderMan pitch, which is I'll link in the end. So for this pitch, I think it would be cool to have kind of like a Mad Men style TV series. You know, imagine it's on Netflix, 10 episodes, and it's set in like the 50s, 60s, New York City, and it's all about Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and some others, which I'll mention, creating Marvel. Now, if you don't know, Stan Lee was born Stanley Lieber in 1922 in Manhattan, New York. And with the help of Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko and many others, which I'll mention, they went on to create some of the greatest IP or superheroes ever known, from Fantastic Four, Incredible Hulk, Doctor Strange, Spider-Man, of course, Thor, Ant-Man, and the list goes on and on and on. So I think the challenge for me creating this pitch was, you know, it doesn't necessarily make sense to be a movie. There's just too much kind of rich history to cram in 2 hours. It really needs a TV series. But the challenge with that is that a lot of this stuff happened over decades. I mean, there's a whole chunk of Stan's life where he goes to war. And so like, do you focus on like just like the Marvel stuff and ignore like what got him there, like the Fantastic Four, Incredible Hulk, and just start at like Spider-Man? I just felt like that wasn't really the best starting place. The best starting place is like fresh out of high school, 18 years old, which I'll eventually get into. But I just kind of want to state that up front because, you know, I sometimes move some things around or I condense some of the timeline just to kind of fit everything in. The other thing that I wanted to do, which I don't think has ever been done before, I know there's a movie called, I think it's called Waking Life. I have to research that, but it's like somebody like colored or like drew over every single frame of the movie. So it almost looks like this like real life cartoon coming to life. I would want to not necessarily do that, but do something similar to that. Kind of incorporate like comic book art or art into this TV series. And I wasn't really sure how to do that. And I think what I came up with was, you know, kind of how like Spider-Man has that spidey sense that kind of tingles and like his environment changes depending on, you know, the comic or the animated series that you watch. I would have something like that. So Stan Lee is like this modern day Bill Shakespeare. He's this like super creative guy. I think it would be cool to have at certain points throughout the TV series when like the muse inspires him, when he gets this like burst of creativity, we kind of see the world through the lens of Stan Lee's eyes. So like the way I envision it is like this like almost animation crawls across the screen. So as he's like walking down the street, he gets like this moment of inspiration and like, you know, the Empire State Building turns into like a cartoon. But it's like a wave that passes. So it's like cartoon, but then back to real life. And then he sees a guy, like a businessman walking down the street, like with a suit and like a briefcase. And he turns into like this warrior with like armor and a battle axe. And then like the wave goes like, you know, past him. So he turns back into the man with the suit. So like in real life, I would like to incorporate something like this. And maybe like his boss at a certain point is like yelling at him. And he kind of has a flash of like J. Jonah Jameson, and you could see him kind of like smirking and like writing in his notebook. I think that'd be cool. You don't want to overdo it, but I think kind of putting something like that and incorporate the comic book element would be really, really cool. Okay, so without further ado, here's my TV series pitch for The Marvelous Ones, the story of Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. Okay, so season 1, episode 1, we have establishing shots of New York City. This is set, it's a period piece, so it's set in like the 40s, 50s, and then eventually the 60s. But the story starts in 1940, so I want to really capture what New York looked like at that time. So, you know, what were the buildings look like, and, you know, the people and like the clothing and the cars and all that kind of stuff, like the storefronts. I'd want to capture all that, but how I would do it would be like the opening shot would be like these panning shots of New York City, but each shot would be like set in a comic book panel. So for instance, we would see this page of a comic book and like maybe it's like the Empire State Building, and it would zoom in and that would take full frame. And then we would kind of see what that would look like. It would pan out, go to the next frame or the next panel, which would be some like kid handing out newspapers on like, you know, like a shipping dock or whatever. And it'd go like to all these panels. Maybe the page would flip and it'd go to like this apartment of, you know, in Manhattan where Stan Lee lives. And then it would maybe zoom in on his apartment. And then the shot I'd like to do is like going around his room, looking at like all the kind of figurines and comic books and books. He's got like a bookshelf with like, you know, Sherlock Holmes and, you know, like maybe a Superman comic and some like little army figurines, because that was kind of like the climate at the time. It's like the Great Depression. And so I pan around his room. Maybe there's like a movie poster for like a monster movie or something. I don't know if this stuff existed back in the day, but I think that'd be kind of cool to kind of show that he's like this kid. He's like 18, 19, and he's into this stuff. So the camera is kind of like panning around his room. And then it spins around to a shot of him staring at himself in the mirror, like fumbling with a tie and him like getting really frustrated, right? And then it pans around from like the mirror reflection of him to actually him. And we see this like young kid, 18-year-old Stan Lee, kind of hair slicked back, very, you know, 40s-esque like clothing. And, you know, the camera like single shot follows him down the hallway to this like 2-bedroom apartment into the kitchen. And he's like, hey, Dad, can you help me tie my tie? And his dad's like reading a newspaper, eating breakfast or whatever at the table. And he's like, no, like go get your mother to help you, right? So then the camera follows him. He talks to his mother. His mother, he's got a younger brother who's 9 years younger than him. So he's like 9 years old at the time. And his mother is like, you know, busy taking care of like, you know, making lunches and making sure that the kid's got his hair brushed and his teeth brushed and all that kind of stuff. Putting the kid's jacket on. So the mom like folds the tie like for him and gives him some pep talk, how like this is going to be his first day at work and he's going to be great and have confidence and all this kind of stuff. And, you know, really giving this inspiring message like, Stan, you're like, whatever, God's gift to writing or whatever, maybe some cheesy thing like that. I don't know. Now, Stan Lee's father is a dress cutter, and this is like the tail end of the Depression. So I kind of want to establish the social, economic, political climate at the time, you know? And so as they leave for work, so Stan and his father leave together at the same time and they walk to the subway. And so I'd kind of want to show another, you know, them walking in New York City. I think that'd be really cool. I'm not sure how you'd do that, probably CG. So they're standing at the subway and, you know, maybe they're going to get on different trains or something. Stan's father's going to go to his job and Stan's going to go the other way for his first day of work. And his father, who grabs him, says, you know, look, Stan, give you 2 pieces of advice. Be really kind to everybody, number 1, and never leave before your boss. That's it. And so he sends him on his way, and Stan rides the subway, shows up to this office, and doesn't know what to expect, and walks in, meets his boss. Now, Stan, through a distant relative, knows this guy named Martin Goodman. Now, Martin Goodman runs Timely Comics and, you know, agrees to bring Stan on just as an assistant, doing, you know, basic junior level stuff like proofreading and erasing pencil marks and, you know, getting coffee or whatever. And so Stan arrives at the office and he takes a tour, introduces himself to Jack Kirby, and who's probably similar in age to him, and Joe Simon. And, you know, they kind of give a tour of the office, nothing special. And then they go into Martin Goodman's office. Stan gets sit down. He's about to be briefed for his first day of work. And Martin Goodman then explains kind of the origins of, you know, comic books and like where this all came from. So Goodman asks him, do you know where comic books came from? And Stan like shrugs, shakes his head. He's like, no. And he proceeds to tell him that, you know, in 1933, this cat named MC Gaines was a publisher for newspapers, and he'd run little comic strips in the newspapers, and they became like wildly popular. People loved reading those things. But the newspaper only ran from Monday to Friday. So on the weekends, to keep like the publishing press going and to like kind of make money, this guy would take all the comic strips throughout the week and like print them in comic books. So you could just buy a book of the comic strips, right? And so in 1938, Superman was, you know, DC Comics came out with Superman, the first like superhero comic book character, and it became wildly successful amongst youths, like kids and teenagers. And 2 years later, a company was formed called Timely Comics, which is where Stan is right now. So Stan kind of gets this history. So we see Stan kind of like, almost like maybe a montage. We want to kind of speed up time. This is the first episode. We show him like, you know, learning the business, making mistakes, you know, getting in people's way, offering to help, you know, doing whatever he can. He's working like a dog, and he's remembering, you know, his father told him, be kind to everybody and never leave before your boss. Now, the boss is there till like 7 at night, and Stan is exhausted, right? So eventually the boss leaves, and Stan leaves, takes a subway home, gets home. There's a plate of food waiting for him. He eats it. His mother, father asks him how his first day of work was, and they have some kind of conversation. Okay, so the next week goes by almost in like this montage, similar montage fashion, waking up, riding the train, going to work, coming home, sleeping. I don't know, maybe I'd figure out a creative way to show that. Maybe through a comic book page or something like that, or a text overlay that says like, you know, 1 week later, 1 month later, or whatever. I don't know how to do that, but eventually he's gonna have a conversation with his father and almost like complain, like, you know, they don't take any of my ideas seriously. I try to tell them like, you know, about a trend or what I like, or, you know, what they should do, and nobody listens to me. And his father is like, look, man, you've been there a month, like pump the brakes. Nobody cares about your opinion. You're 18, 19, like you have to pay your dues. This is kind of the way the world works. And Stan he's had jobs before, but nothing where he's actually excelled at, like, you know, he's a creative, he's a writer, and he's going in and watching other people create and other people write, and nobody's willing to listen to him. And it's kind of like infuriating. It's frustrating for him, right? So I'd probably end the episode there, you know, on the end of this kind of like speech, right? Nothing crazy, no cliffhangers or anything like that. This is opening episode, introduction to the character, introduction to the setting, and this story is going to take time to build, so not everything is going to be like super crazy like that. And I won't go through every episode in this much detail, but I'll paint like kind of broad strokes and hit some of the pivotal points. So Timely Comics started producing Captain America to compete with Superman, and it was very, very successful. So they had Jack Kirby and Joe Simon working on this book, and after about 10 issues, there was some dispute over financials, and Jack Kirby and Joe Simon, they leave. And at this time, Stan has established himself a little bit more within the company, and he's now getting some kind of, he's allowed to write some copy for, like, I think he wrote his first kind of foray into comics. He wrote an introduction to a Captain America book, and he put it as Stan Lee. Now, I mentioned his real name is Stanley Lieber. He actually changed his name, like used this pen name, because he was embarrassed by like working in the comics, and he always kind of fancied himself as a writer. And he's like, you know what, one day I'm gonna write like the great American novel, and I'll use my real name, Stanley Lieber, and I don't want that to be like at all associated with this like comic book stuff. So he's starting to get like some copywriting work at the like Timely Comics, and when Jack Kirby and Joe Simon leave, Stan gets kind of promoted to like editor-in-chief, and he starts writing Captain America books. And really the only reason why Goodman, like the publisher, like did this is because he didn't actually respect comics. He thought this was like frivolous, or, you know, like for children. So he's like, well, anyone can write this. This isn't not that, like, this is not literature. This is not that important. Like, yeah, sure, 19-year-old kid, go ahead, write it. Like, because he didn't care about it, that's why Stan Lee got his shot, which I think is really cool. So again, we have to figure out a creative way to do the transitions. You know, maybe like Stan's walking, and we figure out a way where like the background changes, so it like kind of connotes that like there's a passage of time. So maybe like office, so as he's like walking in the hall, like he's walking in normal speed, but everything around him is like changing, and posters are coming up and going on the wall, and people are moving in like this time warp speed, and maybe his clothes are changing. And as he goes into the office, he tells Goodman, he's like, look, I have to leave. I've been enlisted in the war. So maybe we'll do like a text overlay to say like 1942 or whatever the time was, to kind of imply, you know, time has been passed, and this is now like several years after he started working at the company. But even, it's only like episode 3. So like we need to kind of speed the story along here, because just in the interest of time. Okay, so World War II was 1939 to 1945. Stan Lee returns from the war when I believe the war ends. And I think it'd be cool if he becomes roommates with Jack Kirby. I don't know if, I'm pretty sure this is not true. I just made it up, but I think that'd be cool. And we could kind of allow this creative freedom to have these two interact, because it's not really clear how they eventually interacted again. But so he's back from the war, he's writing comics, he's writing anything that's kind of trendy at the time, like Westerns and monster and horror and like, you know, basically anything that's like humor, anything that was trending, he would write and was able to kind of pump them out very quickly. So Jack and Stan, they have this tiny apartment living in Queens, and they're, you know, doing young kid stuff. They're like going to parties, and we'd show Stan like visit his parents and, you know, it'd just show his life. And so he'd go to parties and he would meet people. This is a true story. And he'd be so embarrassed by what he did. He tried to be like so vague about it. When somebody asked him what he did, he'd be like, oh, I'm a writer. And like, oh, what do you write? He'd be like, nah, just like stories. And eventually they'd pressure him and they'd find out that he writes comics, and they'd immediately lose interest. So that's kind of like the climate at the time. People didn't really take this seriously. At one particular social event, he was going to be set up on a blind date with this girl, and I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, the story goes, as he was entering, a different girl opens the door, and he looks at her and was like completely taken aback by her, and he says to her, I think I'm gonna fall in love with you. Now, Stan is known as a writer, but he's also like dabbled in a little bit of like drawing and art as a kid. And as one does, I do it sometimes. Like I tend to have go-to things that I draw over and over, like a particular face, or, you know, so he was drawing like male faces and female faces, but like specifically one female face based on his like idealized version of a woman. And so when he meets this girl, wouldn't you know, she's like a spitting image of this drawing, and he tells her like, I've been drawing you for years. So it's almost like this like destiny or this fate moment that like him and this girl, Joan, who, spoilers, later turns out to be his wife. So this is kind of like the meet cute, if you will, like how these two characters meet, and Joan will become like a staple in the show. She, you know, it's a kind of a crazy story actually. Stan proposes to her. Again, this is like middle of the 1940s, totally different time. He proposes to her 2 weeks after dating, which is a terrible idea. And also, she happened to be married at the time. She was married to some other guy. So, as the story goes, she says yes to Stan because she's bored of her husband. She's like cheating on her husband with Stan. Divorces him at like some courthouse by like this one judge. And then an hour later gets married to Stan at the same courthouse by the same judge. Like absolutely absurd. So I'd definitely put that in. And then I would maybe change up like the living dynamics. He moves out with Joan, and Jack Kirby's kind of on his own. Okay, so we're nearing the end of the season. We've got a few more episodes, and I really need to jump ahead. I believe Stan and his wife marry in 1947. I need to skip ahead till 1954. Now, at this point, Stan has been writing comics for over half of his life, and he's kind of, you know, well, let me get to it. So at the time, parents were kind of growing concerned about the violent nature of comic books. You know, there's a lot of like shooting and killing and crime and horror and all that kind of stuff. It was actually brought, in 1954, is brought to a subcommittee of the Senate for juvenile delinquency, which were to oversee like the appropriateness of comic books for children. And so the end result of that was, you know, a self-regulated authority called the Comics Code Authority was created by the comic book industry to say, look, no, we will self-regulate this. We don't want the government involved, and we will make sure, you know, the language is appropriate and there's no graphic violence or anything like that. So, and Goodman, Stan's boss and the publisher of Timely, like he didn't care. He's like, whatever sells, I don't care. So, you know, Stan is writing this stuff, but it's very, you know, uninspired. It's boring. It's safe. Everything has to be approved by the CCA, this Comic Code Authority, and he's just in a slump. He's not interested in this stuff anymore. His boss doesn't want him to use like rich vocabulary and intricate storytelling because he's like, this is for children, just write that. So Stan goes home to his wife and he's complaining. He's like, I'm thinking about quitting. And she goes, you know what, why don't you just come up with something that you want to write? Like, and, you know, tell the story that you want to hear, and have your friend Jack, draw it up and then pitch that idea. The worst case scenario is that they reject it and you get fired, but who cares, because you're going to quit anyway. So it's kind of win-win. Doesn't really matter. So I think in the final, which is a very pivotal moment, that speech by his wife Joan actually was the creation of Fantastic Four. So he goes to Jack Kirby, his old roommate, his buddy. They create Fantastic Four, and maybe the final episode, they're putting it together and he pitches it to Goodman, and I'd probably maybe close the episode there. Not really a cliffhanger, but kind of a cliffhanger. That's season 1. We covered a lot of grounds over 15 years. This young Stan working in comics, getting married, going to war, all this kind of stuff would be season 1, and we would end on Fantastic Four. We haven't even got to Marvel yet. So the year is 1962. Marvel Comics is just starting off, riding the kind of wave of success from Fantastic Four. Timely Comics turns into Marvel Comics, and they bring on like top tier talent like Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, John Romita Jr., John Buscema, Larry Lieber, who's actually Stan's little brother. And they create, in 1962, they create the Incredible Hulk. So Stan goes to Jack Kirby and says, I need a monster, but like make him like a good monster, like a good looking monster, not scary, a character where people can kind of sympathize with him. So Jack Kirby drew the Incredible Hulk. And so they started writing that story. That becomes a huge success. They create an animated TV series of the Hulk, I believe in 1964 that came out. No, that was 1966. And so they created this thing called the Marvel Method, which was a way where Stan would kind of pitch ideas, almost similar to like what I'm doing right now, where I just talk about it. And then the illustrators, the artists draw whatever like Stan talks about. And then Stan goes in and like does all like the dialogue or whatever. So it's a very quick way. There's no script, and it's a very quick way to like pump out comics. So that's what they're doing. They're just pumping out these things. And from like 1961 to 1962, Marvel's sales like skyrocketed from like 7 million books to like 13 million books, like almost doubling. So comics was like, this is like the golden era of comics, golden age. And Stan Lee is just like coming up with all these different ideas. And this is really kind of like the heyday of the show. We haven't got the SpiderMan yet, but business is booming. Now, I would like to see some, how I had that like comic book style integrated into the show. I would like to see something like that where like maybe like a guy's like web slinging or something like that, crawling up the side of a building, and he's in Queens, and I want to see him kind of put the pieces together of Spider-Man. And then he sit down with Jack Kirby and goes, what's always bothered me is a teenager is always looked at as the sidekick. And I remember being a teenager. I was 18. I started Timely Comics, and they never took me seriously because of my youth. And that always kind of bothered me. So why don't we create a superhero that's a teenager, and he's from like where we live, like Queens, and he's called, I don't know, like Peter Parker or something like that. And he's got a boss who's really aggressive, kind of like Martin Goodman was to him. So you can see the early stages of like the wheels turning of him putting together Spider-Man. I think that'd be super cool. And then so Jack Kirby draws, let's say like the cover of like Amazing Fantasy #1, and like that iconic image of Spider-Man like holding that guy. I think that'd be cool to show that. And this comes out, I believe August 1962 is the first issue of Spider-Man in Amazing Fantasy. So I think season 2 would be really cool to like, it's like the heyday. We needed season 1 to get to season 2. It wouldn't necessarily make sense to start at season 2, but season 2 is really where Marvel kind of takes off, and you have like the Marvel DC wars, and you see some of like the methodology and the philosophy behind Marvel, how Stan always wants these heroes to, like do good and like do the right thing and to be moral, these like moral compasses for society. He would be like doing interviews, not necessarily like rock star status, but he's gaining some notoriety. He's, you know, coming up with different characters like Doctor Strange and, you know, Ant-Man and Daredevil and Iron Man and Thor. So this whole season is like really ramping up, and they're just pumping out these books, and they're awesome. And I would show awesomeness. This is not a real pitch. Like, I'm not bringing this to any studio to have it made. I'm just suggesting the concept. If anyone wants to do this, like, I'm assuming the people like that own all this IP would do it. Like, if anyone's to do it, it would be them, and they would have a lot of the backstories, which I don't have. Who am I? I don't know anything. So they would fill in a lot of the gaps, tell these really, really cool stories, or these really pivotal moments where, you know, somebody like fights for something, like this Jon Favreau moment where he fights for like Robert Downey Jr. and Iron Man, and then becomes a huge smash. Something like that, but in like 1962. It's like, no, it has to be called Iron Man, not Tin Man, or something like that. I'd like to have some of those stories, and I'm obviously not the best person to tell those stories, but you can kind of get the idea and like peek behind the curtain of what was going on at Marvel at the time. And I don't know, that's pretty much as far as I got. I don't necessarily know what a season 3 would look like. So yeah, there's my idea. There's my pitch for The Marvelous Ones, a TV series set in the 1940s to 1960s about basically the creation of Marvel. Stan Lee, Steve Ditko, Jack Kirby, John Buscema, John Romita Jr., Larry Lieber. I think that would be really cool. Let me know in the comments what you think. If you can think of ways we can make it better, any stories that I missed or things you think that would be cool to see, let me know in the comments below. If you like the video, please like the video. Please share it with your friends. Please subscribe to my channel. I do weekly movie pitches or TV pitches every week. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.